Well, super excited to have Nikhil Buduma, who is the co-founder and CEO of Ambience Healthcare, one of the most talked about healthcare AI companies of the last few years. Fresh off a $243 million Series C raise, their technology is changing lives. I've noticed it firsthand. I've experienced it firsthand. You guys are at large healthcare systems like Memorial Hermann, Cleveland Clinic, UCS Health. Welcome.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, excited to be chatting with you. So I did some internet stalking and went down YouTube. And I guess when you're our age, there's like those old YouTube videos that exist now that didn't exist for, people ahead of us. And one of the ones I found out was you were obviously an overachiever back then, but you were talking about whooping cough and vaccines and things like that. That one. And I was wondering, you obviously had a interest and passion for healthcare and the life sciences back then. What kind of made you want to learn about biology and those kind of things? And then you obviously then went on to study computer engineering. And so tell me about those kind of interests and how those came to be.
For sure. I started the company with Mike in 2020, and Mike and I have been working together for about 11 years now at the intersection of healthcare and AI. And we both have our own sort of stories on how we ended up in healthcare. For Mike, he fractured his back, was told he may never be able to walk again. And you go through a set of experiences like that. And it's hard to imagine something more worthwhile to be spending your time on than medicine and healthcare.
Yeah.
For me, my family went through an incredibly difficult situation navigating the healthcare system when I was a child. They came from rural India, didn't have coverage. My family went through severe financial difficulties after I was born. I had several heart issues. I ended up with sepsis several times before I turned 10.
Wow.
So, in many ways, I owe my existence to the miracle of modern medicine. And thought for most of my life that I was going to be a clinician. I was sort of on the MD PhD track, um, and I ended up losing a mentor actually to a medical error. And I think that's ultimately the experience that threw into question whether I wanted to be focused specifically on medicine on the front lines or thinking more holistically about is there an opportunity to leverage technology to make the practice of medicine better holistically.
Yeah.
And around 2012, 2013 was a time where AI was really starting to take off for the first time. You might remember all of the excitement around computer vision. People thought self-driving cars were around the corner.
Yeah.
Um, I wrote one of the first books on deep learning, got really deeply embedded with some of the early research teams, like the OpenAI team when they were first getting started. I think for Mike and I, we spent a lot of time thinking about, did we want to join one of these frontier AI research labs at the very beginning, or did we want to be focused specifically on translating these technologies to healthcare? And for us, just given our experiences, we felt like the latter was going to be a much more fulfilling way to spend our time. And so that's sort of the story behind how we got to where we are.
Yeah, that's a really special and really comes from a personal place. And I think that's where, when something's personal to you, that's when you put all that energy in and something good usually comes out of it.
Yeah.
You obviously mentioned 2013, AI was around, but for the average person, probably not on their radar. And then we obviously had the chat GPT moment. That's when everyone's like, oh, AI is the thing. And it came about overnight. Obviously it didn't come about overnight. It had been decades of work. But for you, where we're at right now with Ambience Healthcare and then the rest of the landscape, is it something that you expected, like say in 2017, 2018? Did you think we would be at this place, or you think it came quick as well?
So the story is um, when Mike and I decided to not join OpenAI full time and instead start our own healthcare company, um, we were actually on the front lines trying to build technology for clinicians. And as you can imagine, that's a hard task.
Yeah.
Like hiring clinicians, implementing an EHR, even getting the technology to work back then. Because if you recall, 2017 is when Transformers came into existence.
Yeah.
And that's the foundation on top of which all of this sort of work started to happen. And so we were very, very much in the early innings around this class of technologies. But we were still very close to a lot of the foundational researchers working at OpenAI, some of whom left to start Anthropic. And we remember In 2018, 2019, we saw the first demo of GPT-2 over the dinner table.
Yeah.
And it was the first sign that we were beginning to see the underlying technology really start to solve the hard problems around language and language modeling. And over the next couple of years, we started to see a couple of other breakthroughs, including the neural scaling laws, which showed that as you made these models bigger and bigger, you could predictably make them smarter. We saw the advent of reinforcement learning by human feedback to make these models far more useful as assistants. And I think around 2020, there was enough evidence for Mike and I to basically say, we think we're at the very beginning of an exponential curve. And it's unclear whether it's the time span of 1 year, 3 years, or 5 years, but it's somewhere in that range that everyone's going to have access to these really intelligent general purpose reasoning models at their fingertips. And lo and behold, now we all have ChatGPT and other language models on our phones. And there had to be a team really specifically focused on how do we take the most capable general purpose reasoning models, turn them into the most capable clinical reasoning models, and actually bridge the gap between those models existing in a silo versus actually being embedded and integrated into the workflow to be useful for a clinician like yourself.
Yeah. And this is a perfect transition into what I wanted to talk about next. So the hospital system I work at, we use Ambience Healthcare. We use the scribe technology in the ER. And it's, honestly, I'm not exaggerating when I say it's been a game changer for me, where, I feel like I can spend that extra minute in the patient room. I feel like I go back and update patients more frequently because I'm not worried about I have to get that note done. I can actually focus on other tasks. I've used some other AI scribe tools out there. They're good, but I feel like you all are probably better. And so the question is, you obviously are context specific, right? You're kind of making something for the ER or other clinical specialties. What does that work look like? What does that training look like? How do you make sure that something used in the ER versus like a primary care clinic is different, but also be useful and effective in each one of those settings?
Maybe I'll flip the question to you first. I'm curious from your perspective, what makes the ER so challenging and why is it that you feel like ambience performs differently from the other technologies that you saw?
Yeah, so the ER is challenging for anyone, right? Like if you put a primary care doctor in an ER, they're probably going to pull their hair out. It's because you have no idea what's coming. You could have 3 critically sick patients at the same time, and you're making quick decisions. You have no pre-planning. There's no like I'm not sitting there 20 minutes looking at what this patient's history is or whatnot. A lot of times they don't know their history. They've never been in our system, and it's like, hey, we have 3 minutes of information to make a whole bunch of decisions on. And I feel like the technology you guys have, it actually picks the relevant parts of that conversation,
Mhm.
includes it in the note, right? So we have patients all the time, like Gran will come in and talk about, a surgery she had a year ago that is not relevant in any way, like an ankle surgery, relevant in any way to the chest pain she's coming in with.
Yeah.
And I feel like other tech I've used, sometimes they may include that part of the story, which is not relevant. I'm gonna have to delete it afterwards because then, if someone's I say I admit the patient, the hospitalist is gonna be like, well, what did we do about this ankle pain? And that ankle pain was never the complaint, but I feel like y'all's technology leaves that out. And so I am amazed. I'm like, how does that happen? How does it know that this is not relevant? And so I'm not as technical, obviously. I'm not technical at all, but I wonder, like, how does that happen?
Yeah. And building upon that, there's probably also workflow differences too, because in your setting, you're seeing a patient over multiple hours.
Yeah.
And the way you think about documentation, what you're documenting, when you're documented, how you share it with the rest of the care team is very different from a primary care visit where you just sit down, you got 15 minutes with a patient, and then you're done. You move on to the next patient. So I think you're putting down a lot of really important points. And I think the way we think about it is this. If you're trying to build a useful assistant to a clinician, you almost have to create a clone of themselves. And to do that requires a couple of things. You have to think very deeply about what's the job to be done. You have to build an AI system that can reason about the medicine that's happening in that visit at the same level of accuracy and specificity that a clinician in the ED would be thinking about that visit. And then you have to also be thinking about what does the clinician actually have to do now inside of Epic or inside of another EHR, and how do we make sure that the workflow is seamless enough that we're not adding more clicks or adding more burden to the workflow? Because if you're as you can probably attest, especially in a place like the ED, if you're adding more work to a clinician's plate, that's the fastest way to get
Yeah, yeah,
abandoned.
yeah.
And so the way we think about it is you're almost building a different product for every single one of these specialty and subspecialty areas. Even within a place like Houston Methodist or Memorial Hermann, where you've got um, a specialty like ENT. ENT is probably got 7 different subspecialties in it. The sleep surgeon is doing something completely differently from the laryngologist. And so for us to serve a health system like Memorial Hermann, to serve a system like Cleveland Clinic, we're not building one product. We're building almost like 100 different AI products. That's a very different sort of kind of challenge to go tackle. Is that helpful?
Yeah, yeah. So it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. And it's probably really hard work. You have to sit down with the clinicians, see what they need, what their patients are like, what information is relevant, and I imagine that takes a lot of time.
100%.
Yeah,
And both clinically, the workflow, all the nuances around coding and billing, critical care, incredibly relevant to document and code for in the ED, not relevant at all in primary care.
yeah,
Modifier 25s, incredibly relevant in primary care, completely irrelevant in the ED.
yeah, yeah. One of the kind of stereotypes for healthcare is that we're slow to adopt technology. It takes a long time. It's traditionally been true, but I've been pleasantly surprised over the last few years where, every hospital or most hospitals have some type of AI governance committee. They're looking at pilots and they're actually open to embracing this technology. From your perspective, when you go to health systems, is that something you've noticed? They're like more open with AI and certain tools to say, hey, we're going to move faster, we're going to move quicker. And have there been kind of barriers that you've hit with some systems, and how do you kind of solve those, I guess?
Yeah. There's probably 2 lenses. There's one component that I think is universal and has nothing to do with ambience, and it applies to everybody. And then there's a couple of things that we do very specifically to address that problem. I think the general sort of macro perspective that affects all AI companies is this. We went from nobody understanding what AI was to 100 million people having access to it on their phone within 2 months with the launch of ChatGPT. And when you see diffusion of technology that quickly, organizations become AI curious overnight as well, because every single one of their employees is starting to ask, well, can't I bring this into work? Because this would be very, very useful for me at work. And so one of the challenges for a lot of organizations was there's a risk that if I don't do something, if I don't have a stance and if I don't communicate how I'm going to solve these problems for my clinicians, the risk is if they download something that's not secured, where we don't have any governance, no contracting, they download it on their personal phones and they bring it in.
Yeah,
Right. And so I think that dynamic has definitely prompted the vast majority of systems to take a proactive approach as to what are the use cases that matter, where are they going to invest, and actually putting real resources behind trying to have a strategy. And I think that affects all AI companies, not just us. I think when it comes specifically to ambience, there's probably 2 pieces that we think about obsessively. The first is part of the reason why technology adoption in healthcare is tended to be slow is because it's unclear whether or not the technologies have actually solved a real problem for the end user on the ground. And you know this better than most. If you are adding work to a clinician's plate, it doesn't matter how visionary your pitch is. The reality is you won't get adoption.
yeah,
But if you are truly obsessive over creating experience that feels magical and you achieve adoption, then all of a sudden clinicians start to pull the technology. And that's what takes something that would have otherwise taken many, many years to diffuse across the ecosystem to a technology that can go from 0 to everyone's talking about it in
yeah,
the span of 12 months. The other reason why technology can be slow is as much as we'd like to innovate, the reality is health systems are under immense financial pressure, and that poses real headwinds to adoption of technology. Because the question is, how are we going to pay for this stuff? And I think the secondary component where we spend a lot of time is how do we not only solve a problem for the clinician on the ground, but also how do we take the burden of things like quality and revenue cycle that are otherwise distractions for the clinician off of their plate and do them well enough that we could actually use revenue cycle and quality to build the business case for funding this technology. And so if you solve a problem for the chief medical officer by creating something that's valuable for the clinicians, but you also solve a big problem for the chief financial officer by having a clear business case for how you pay for the technology, that also really accelerates the technology diffusion cycle.
Yeah. So, and one thing I'm curious about is like I see basically most ER physicians will see about 2 patients an hour. With ambience, I still see 2 patients an hour. I don't see like 4 patients an hour, but I mentally feel better about each one of those interactions and whatnot. So I see the benefit to myself. Does that translate to, I guess, better ROI for the institutions and investment? And if it does, how does that happen? Is it just the billing codes generator better or on the back end, or I'd love to get a better understanding of that.
Yeah. There's a couple of pieces, and as you can imagine, the story is very different by specialty because the economics of every service line is different.
Yeah.
But in the emergency department, what we're finding is one, having this technology means you don't have to invest in human scribes who also can be inconsistent. You don't have 100% coverage and they're very expensive.
Yeah.
Two, we are actually starting to see improvements in throughput in especially some of the highest volume emergency departments and trauma centers, which has downstream implications for revenue. But the third is when documentation is an afterthought, the last thing you're thinking about is, am I checking off all the boxes in my MDM for a billing perspective? Did I actually get that fracture care documented? Did I actually get the critical care that I performed documented correctly? And the nice thing about something like Ambience is by virtue of understanding where those value levers come from and making it easy for a clinician to just click a button and add some of those elements that they've already done and they're just weren't getting credit for in the past to the documentation means that with very little additional work, we're able to solve a big economic problem for the ED.
Yeah.
Obviously, as we talked about, how we solve that for primary care versus what are the biggest levers in oncology versus the biggest levers in cardiology are all different. But it's a similar idea, which is how do we make doing the right thing easy? How do we make doing the right thing obvious in a way that's seamless in the workflow?
Yeah, 100%. After a 12-hour shift, billing codes are the last thing I want to think about.
Yeah.
I'm curious, with you all being, like you mentioned, making hundreds of products for each specialty line, what does that look like? Is that having advisors from each specialty? Is that what does the logistics of that look like?
There's a number of pieces. It starts with building models that deeply understand the medicine being practiced. And a big part of it is actually bringing in some of the very best specialists in the country to actually battle test these models, identify their weak points, and building data sets to improve them. One of the things that I think is misunderstood in our space is documentation is not a summary of the conversation. It's a reflection of your medical decision making.
Yeah.
And more often than not, especially in some of the most complex specialties, that decision making is never verbalized. And so one of the things we oftentimes hear from clinicians about their ambience experience is that it feels like the technology read their mind. And the only way that's possible is because the model is sort of reading between the lines of what's spoken to implicitly understand what is the clinician really thinking about? What do they really mean when they say these things? And making sure that's reflected in documentation, even if the clinician didn't explicitly have to say it
Yeah.
verbally out loud in the visit. So that's one component. How do you get these models to be really, really good at clinical reasoning? The second part of it is workflow. And we're going to move a little bit out of the ED for this example, but to give you an appreciation, you think about an oncologist. 70% of their visits are follow-up visits. And for the vast majority of follow-up visits, the oncologist could have written the documentation before the patient even walked in the room. It's because the the charting burden for an oncologist is pre-charting. It's not ambient listening. And so for the oncologist, we had to build an entirely different set of capabilities, which is a clinical reasoning engine. We call it patient summary. But what it does is it pours through the past notes, the labs, the faxed reports from pathology, and builds a view specific to the oncologist that tells you what's this patient's cancer, what was the staging of that cancer at the last visit, how's that staging changed given the latest lab data that we have on this particular patient, the latest pathology, the latest imaging. What's the evidence that leads us to believe this care pathway is working? If it's not working, what are the alternative care pathways? If it is working, what are the next steps on this care pathway? And that's now the input to producing documentation. And if you have one system doing this past reasoning and a different system listening to the conversation, it's a broken workflow.
Yeah.
And so you can imagine we had to not only build models that deeply understand the medicine, but then also make sure they're instantiated in products that deeply are embedded in the workflow of what the clinician's actually doing for different types of visits.
Yeah, so in that situation, it's almost like having a medical assistant or a nurse kind of going through everything and giving you the quick summary, or like a med student giving you a quick summary before you walk in and see the patient, but tech does it essentially.
100%.
That's really cool. Obviously, I alluded to the huge funding round. Congrats on that. That obviously means that you guys are expanding, but there's going to be a lot of innovation. So I'm curious about what are some other things that are, and you kind of alluded to the chart summary, but that are going along with the ambient listing that you may be looking at or in development that y'all have spoken about publicly that you could share.
There's two areas of focus for us, beyond just continue to work with more health systems at scale. The first is, as we started to build patient summary, clinicians started asking us, well, what if we had more questions? Can we just talk to the EHR like we would talk to ChatGPT? So we created this capability called Chart Chat, which basically integrates directly with Epic. It can read through all the notes, here, everywhere, the past labs, fax documents, and it can answer all sorts of questions on behalf of the clinician. And so you can say something like, hey, can you trend this patient's hemoglobin A1C over the last 6 months and overlay it across other biomarkers that I might be interested in? It also is able to access medical calculators. It's able to access evidence-based guidelines. And so now all of a sudden, while you're at the bedside with this patient, you get to essentially almost feel like you've got like a AI clinical co-pilot to help you make better decisions without having to leave the room to look up something on UpToDate.
Yeah.
So that's something that we're seeing really take off across our existing customer base.
And that's something that's launched already. Y'all
It's
have
launched already.
Yeah.
We over the first couple of months, we started to ask questions around how often is this used, what kinds of questions people asking the system. The results are pretty astonishing. We're finding that people use Chart Chat in a third of all of their visits.
Oh, wow.
And so it is perhaps like one of the most sort of successful products we've ever launched.
And is that something you're seeing more inpatient teams using? Is that something in the ERs, primary care? What setting do you see those most in?
So we've launched it for now in the ambulatory setting.
Okay.
But the question on settings of care brings me to the second thing that really is an area of focus for us, which is we're rapidly building our platform surface area in the inpatient setting. Inpatient setting happens to be one of the most complex areas of care. It also is a place where ambient listening is only 20% of the solution. 80% of the solution is actually complex reasoning over continuously evolving data inside of the EHR. And that is a completely different beast to be able to go tackle. It requires a really sort of cutting edge R&D team to go be able to solve a lot of the challenging problems around how do you write a good progress note? How do you help clinicians pick the right ICD-10 codes for DRG assurance? How do you help close gaps in quality measures? But from our vantage point, the inpatient space happens to be the least well served because it's the most complex to serve. But it's also a place where, as you can imagine, sort of the number of dollars for a health system flowing through the inpatient setting is the next frontier. And so that's the other place where we're putting a lot of energy.
Really cool. Excited to see some of those things in person as well. Kind of last question. This one's kind of more broader. We're at an interesting place in AI, right? You turn on the news, everyone says it's a bubble that's about to pop. Even in healthcare, there's you see some use cases or some ideas where like, do we really need AI for this or whatnot? Where do you think we are in that landscape of this in 2025? Do you think that there might be some type of correction? Do you think that there's obviously lots of good ideas that will be implemented and will come out still? But just curious what your thoughts are on where we're at right now.
It's tricky. MIT, you're probably referring to that MIT study that said 95% of AI pilots are not successful.
Yeah.
But it's not surprising. You think about just the speed at which people turned their heads towards AI, how quickly organizations got AI curious. It's not a surprise that enterprises are signing lots of pilots to explore capabilities. But if you ask the question of what percentage of those pilots are actually showing real results with widespread adoption and real ROI, I think my guess is there's going to be a lot of use cases that seem exciting today that won't seem exciting in 12 months' time.
Yeah.
And so one of the things we think about deeply is how do you solve real problems? How do you solve them extremely well such that you have enduring user adoption? And then how do you use that adoption to then create compounding levels of value for the organization as well? And the companies that solve that problem of who uses, who benefits, who uses, who pays, who benefits, and do that at scale, I think there will be many $100 billion companies in this wave that are built, and there are probably going to be many companies that will cease to exist in a couple years' time. But that's true, I think, of most technology waves. We saw this with cloud and mobile. We saw this with the internet and .com. I think for us, it's about, can we be focused on building a fundamentally good business? And that's really all that matters.
Yeah. Well, I think we're in a really exciting time. I think what you guys have built is really exciting. I've use it every day on shift and excited to use it. And I've actually, I mean, I haven't been practicing medicine for that long, but in the 7 years that I've been in ERs, there's been nothing else that has come close to it. So congrats on building what you have, and I'm excited to see what comes next.
No, thank you. And I think in many ways, the partnership with Memorial Hermann has been instrumental to creating technology that actually works in the ED, like we talked about.
Yeah.
This this technology only really comes to fruition, only works when you have the very best people in a particular specialty area collaborating with the very best technologists. And I think um, your team has been instrumental to making this product come to life. So we deeply appreciate the partnership as well.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you.